Good morning. First of all, Happy New Year and Happy Pongal to all of you. On behalf of the Palkhiwala Foundation, it is our privilege to welcome a very eminent citizen of India, Dr. M R Sreenivasan, who is going to speak on a topic which has engaged the attention of the media and the public, the Indo-US nuclear deal. This is a topic where tempers run high and people tend to take extreme positions. And as Mr. Murli mentioned, Dr. Sreenivasan is one person who has always taken a very balanced view without any kind of preconceived notions or any kind of bias. Let me first introduce the speaker to all of you. Dr. M R Sreenivasan was born in 1930 in Bangalore and completed his engineering at the age of just 20 from the Mysore University in mechanical engineering. He then went to Canada at the McGill University and completed his master's and his PhD in gas turbine technology and jet propulsion. Subsequently, he worked in the United Kingdom for a year, and in 1955, he joined the then Department of Atomic Energy and was involved with setting up Apsara, which was the first research nuclear reactor in 1956. Then in 1959, at just the young age of 29, he was the principal project engineer for setting up of nuclear reactors. And from 59 to 66, they set up the Tarapur nuclear power station, which is in Bombay. From 1966 to 72, he was in charge of setting up the Kalpakam reactor, and then went back to Bombay in 1973, where he was in charge of the Power Projects Engineering Division. In 1983, he became member of the Nuclear Power Board, and became chairman of the Nuclear Power Corporation, and also became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. Dr. Sreenivasan has witnessed the virtual birth of the Atomic Energy Department, which now has 16 operating power reactors, 6 reactors are under construction, and there is 1 prototype fast breeder reactor. He retired in 1990, but still continued his association with atomic energy in the capacity of senior advisor of the International Atomic Energy Agency. From 1996 to 1998, he was a member of the Planning Commission in charge of energy, science, and technology. Currently, he is a member of the Atomic Energy Commission and also chairman of the Task Force for Higher Education for the Government of Karnataka. He has written a book called From Fission to Fusion, which was published in 2002. He has written numerous articles, not only scientific, but also in the media, and all of us read his articles in the Hindu with great interest. Now he has, though partly retired, he divides his time between Bangalore, Ooty, and the rest of the country and the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Palkhiwala Foundation, we are proud to present Dr. Sreenivasan, who will now give us the next Palkhiwala Memorial Lecture. Incidentally, this day is particularly important because it happens to be the birthday of Mr. Nani Palkhiwala. If he were alive, he would have completed 86 years of age. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, Pongal greetings and greetings for the new year. I'm very happy to be here today, this morning, to talk to you on the subject that was suggested by your organizers. Of course, I didn't choose to change the wording of the subject. I thought I would take it in the way that it's been put across to me. But first, a few words about Mr. Nani Palkhiwala, whose birthday it is today. I had the occasion to meet Mr. Nani Palkhiwala for the first time in 1963-64 period. It's a long time ago. At that point of time, Nani Palkhiwala was representing General Electric Company as its tax advisor, because we were negotiating this large project, which was then one of the biggest projects, the project for constructing our first nuclear power station. The contract was going to be awarded to General Electric Company of the United States. And we had to appear before, it was in those days called the Central Board of Revenue, and there was a chairman of the Central Board of Revenue. I do not know if any of you recall those days. There was a very colorful personality by name J.P. Gupta. And it was my good fortune to represent the DAE, the Department of Atomic Energy. Of course, I had no knowledge of taxation law, and here was Nani Palkhiwala, who already was an authority on tax law. However, it was to do with some provisions relating to taxation in that particular contract, and things worked out very well. Then, of course, I used to follow in Bombay the budget discussions, which were annual events in Bombay, much looked forward to by all the people of Bombay. And at least on one occasion, I attended one of those discourses of Nani Palkhiwala, which was at the Brabon Stadium. And believe it or not, the entire stadium was full, and people were also listening from all the side streets and even perhaps the Marine Drive parapet. So he used to draw enormous crowds. Of course, I must say that the Indian tax law is so complex that it is a research work every year, and you don't run out of problems and difficulties in understanding. So even Nani Palkhiwala's lucid analysis probably didn't help many people to get around our taxation complications. Of course, he was a very erudite man, great memory. Those of you who have interacted with him, you will probably remember that on a stage like this, he would stand and all of a sudden he would start quoting from some book, maybe a recent book, maybe an old book or a classic or whatever, and several lines or even a page full of the quotation without a single mistake. And I've seen very few people in recent years who had that enormous memory. Of course, he progressed from being a taxation lawyer then to become a constitutional lawyer, and he participated in many important discussions in the Supreme Court on constitutional issues. Later, as you all know, he became a diplomat. He became the ambassador of India to the United States during the Janata regime, and he did much to re-establish good relations between India and the United States, because there was a great deal of unhappiness after Indira Gandhi had announced or introduced emergency regime in India, and so there was a healing touch that was required, which he did very successfully. In later years, he became a student of Indian philosophy and culture. And in fact, many of his subsequent lectures, he would discuss the great heights that Indian philosophy reached, and he used to remind many of us who had probably become less conscious of our heritage and culture. And he was one of the early leaders of Indian business to be concerned with business ethics, what is now called as corporate governance. A great patriot, certainly, a great citizen of India and also a citizen of the world. I feel honored to speak at this foundation, which is in memory of Nani Palkhiwala. Now, the subject of today's discussion, Indo-US nuclear deal, what is there in it for India? Now, I'll briefly, I do not know how much time I have to speak, but anyway, I'll at least give the outline to the extent that I can, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. First of all, we should look at this Indo-US nuclear deal in a broader and larger context. First, I'll start off with a little bit of history. As you all know, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear bombs were dropped in 1945, and the first demonstration test at Alamogordo had taken place in 1944. This was followed by the Soviet test, Britain, later France, and much later by China in 1964. So in the 20-year period, 1944 to 1964, these five present nuclear weapon powers all had their tests and developed their nuclear weapon programs. Very early on, Bernard Baruch, who used to be an important advisor to Roosevelt and later on to Truman also, he was asked to prepare some early ideas of how to control nuclear energy, because the policymakers in the United States felt that this new kind of energy required some new mechanism to control its spread and usage, and especially to prevent misuse of nuclear energy. But of course, those efforts were premature because the Soviet Union opposed what appeared to be the US desire to take the lead role in exclusive control of nuclear energy. And therefore, the Baruch plan didn't take off. Then in 1955, President Eisenhower announced the Atoms for Peace plan or program. And this was a desire on the part of the US administration led by President Eisenhower that the peaceful users of atomic energy or nuclear energy most correctly, because we should really call it nuclear energy, it's the energy of the nucleus rather than the nucleus of the atom, that the peaceful use of nuclear energy should be made available widely, because it was already known that there was a big potential for producing electricity from nuclear energy, that there are many applications in health, medicine, agriculture, industry, and that all these uses should be promoted without at the same time allowing large-scale misuse in the direction of nuclear weaponry. Of course, there was also an expectation in those days that nuclear power would be too cheap to meter. I remember myself having seen Dr. Baba's projection. Of course, this was made in 1958 or so, or in that period, 55, 60 period. He had forecasted that nuclear power would be costing about 2.5 paisa per unit. But of course, in those days, all other forms of energy also were costing about 3 or 4 or 5 or less than 10 paisa. So, because you must remember the value of money in those days is different from what it is today. Now, in 1955, there was a major conference, the first conference, held in Geneva on the peaceful use of nuclear energy, which was presided over by Homi Bhabha of India. Now, in that conference, and later in the conference in 1958, Dr. Bhabha already analyzed the energy situation of India. He found at that time that we were depending too much on wood, cow dung, agricultural waste as a source of energy for the Indian economy. In those days, it was something like 75%. But now, even now, it's almost 40% plus. So it's not as though we have moved away from that because we're cutting away trees indiscriminately just to give domestic fuel, or we're burning cow dung, which is a very important nutrient for the soil. So we are still depending quite a lot on these traditional sources. And then Dr. Bhabha also said, even in those days, that look, coal, it is only available in central India and eastern India. You got to transport to a long distance, so you burn a good bit of the energy to bring that coal to the consuming centers, and also that we had a high ash content coal, and that we shouldn't continue to burn too much of this coal, and the economics was not attractive. The third thing I observed is that even then, that we really didn't seem to have much oil or gas, and that we would continue to depend a lot on imported hydrocarbons. And finally, he said that while our uranium resources are not large, but we have a large amount of thorium, and that our plan should be to find a way to use this thorium as a source of fuel. So he then outlined already what the so-called three-stage program. I'll come to that a little later. In 1963, India and the US signed an agreement on the Tarapur Atomic Power Station. And I must say here that Dr. Bhabha's role was not only that of a scientist, but he was also a brilliant negotiator. Some of those provisions, both the agreement that he signed with Canada and with the United States at that time, because we also had an agreement on the Rajasthan Atomic Power Station using heavy water as a moderating material and natural uranium. Those are brilliant pieces of negotiation, because in those agreements are reflected what you would call a symmetry. For example, in the Canadian agreement on Rajasthan, not only was India agreeing to put our 2 reactors of Canadian cooperation under international inspection, we had also asked the Canadians to put their own reactor of a similar kind, which these reactors were following, also under international inspection. In fact, even we had sent inspectors to see that the fuel used in those reactors were not diverted. And French at one time wanted to get some uranium from Canada, and they found that the Indians were coming the way of their getting that plutonium rather, for some other purposes. So the equivalence principle was there even in the Tarapur Agreement. What is more, the Tarapur Agreement also had a built-in, I would say, cast iron assurance on supply of fuel for the entire life of the reactor. This was at that time, as it was 30 years. So the agreement signed in 1963 foresaw that the US was obliged to supply enriched uranium fuel for Tarapur reactors until 1993. But of course, that didn't happen, and I'll come to that in a moment. Then there was a 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. The US, along with UK and the Soviet Union, prepared this treaty, which effectively said that the countries that had nuclear tests before 1st January 1967, they were then the 5 countries, which also happened to be the 5 countries of the permanent members of the Security Council, that they would be looked upon as the nuclear weapon powers, and that the rest of the world would then not be looked upon or would not be allowed to become nuclear weapon powers. It was a bargain which initially at least had some degree of equity, because the agreement said, or the treaty said, that the nuclear weapon powers also would over a period of time denuclearize, and that the other countries would not acquire nuclear weapons. But that didn't really happen at all. The reality was that from 1960s or 70s, the US and the Soviet Union went in a huge arms race, building thousands of nuclear weapons, and even now, both of them have got more than 10,000 nuclear weapons each. So this is what's called the vertical proliferation. That is, weaponry with some of these states increasing in enormous scale. Of course, what the treaty did was, it came in the way, or at least succeeded